on. Our next speaker is Sandra. Sandra is one of our PhD students. She's completing a PhD in wildfire research here at Greenwich, and she's also currently employed at Arup as a
shows that transdisciplinary collaboration and work that is so important actually in growing in importance. So the quote I always come back to, which has been underpinning for quite a while for my work, was how many unfortunate people have perished in this disaster because of wanting to take his clothes, another his papers, another his money. And this is a conversation between Voltaire and Rousseau after the 1755 earthquake in Lisbon. And to me, the question was always, why do people still die and perish in disasters? And is there anything that science can do to change this? So I'll take you quickly through the journey of my PhD and the research, and I will look at other motivations that were really important in this research. I'll talk about the background and literature review and research questions that were really important in my thesis. Also, I'll guide you through the methodology that I used in this project and the data collection and, of course, findings. And briefly touch on the latest publication that I successfully managed to take out. So my focus has always been Europe, because I think that there's a lot of work done in other areas, North America and Australia, and somehow it feels like Europe has been neglected. And in a way, there's a lot of evidence that we should focus on European context, because International Panel for Climate Change, IPCC, has published already in 2014 some predictions for the next 50 years. And back then, we already were told that in the future we will have less rainfall in Southern Europe, we will have increase in high temperature extremes, increased wildfire risk in Southern Europe, and this actually the picture that you're seeing on the Telegraph magazine was from 2018, so it's 4 years later than the predictions were done, and Europe was literally in flames. Increased occurrence in fire danger days, that these are the days that are acknowledged in places like Australia as days where you shouldn't be doing a barbecue even, because if your fire escapes, it could lead to big problems. And also increasing the length of dry spell days, and something that Rob touched on, which actually means that the fire seasons could start out earlier and last for longer. Research motivation also comes to human aspects, because more people now live in Wildland-Urban Intermix areas, which is WUI, and growing evacuations and fatalities in number due to wildfires in Europe have been observed over the last 4 years. Another research motivation is that we can actually solve these problems and plan for these disasters, because we are increasingly having more capacity and more tools to plan, such as wildfire evacuation simulation tools. But however, there's a lack of data from European context to actually power those tools so that they increasingly become more intelligent and more reliable. And of course, issues are imminent whenever studying any dominant culture. So if we only rely on data collected in a context other than European context, we don't know what we're missing out on what important aspects we are actually missing. Another motivation is sort of need for guidance, because understanding and considering human behaviors is essential in designing effective evacuation systems, ensuring safety during fire and related emergency events, and accurately reconstructing fire. So human behavior as well in research in built environments, such as buildings and high-rise buildings, but the large outdoor fires have not been researched to such precision so as to make it into any guidance that is used for engineers, for example, or for planners. And here we have some examples of how this is, a wildfire can lead to unpredictable results in terms of human behavior. People might queue in front of the shop to stock up for their food after they have been given an order to evacuate. People might ignore wildfires raging around them, or as some media is saying, and people might have adverse reactions to the stress that they're experiencing because of the need to evacuate and leave their homes. So what I wanted to do for this project is to actually find a way to tackle each of these problems, actually to understand how to collect the data, how to analyze it so it becomes something practicable and something that could be used in computer modeling and essentially simulation, and something that could actually potentially influence policy and practice. So to do that, over the last 3.5 years, I have conducted a literature review where I looked at urban scale evacuation research, human behavior in urban scale evacuations, and urban scale evacuation modeling. So I wanted to bring all those things together. And there were two questions that I wanted to focus on. So what motivates people to evacuate or stay at their property during a wildfire? And how long does it take for people to evacuate? Because these seem to be underpinning questions in our problem. So for the first question, I wanted to build a framework that could be used sort of universally in understanding fires across different contexts. And also I wanted to explore the significance of key pre and peri-event factors, which are sort of gender, age, perhaps training or experience, influencing behavior in wildfire. Another question of how long does it take for people to evacuate was needed to define and quantify behavioral itineraries in evacuation. So what is that people do after they are told to leave or when they decide that they should be leaving their homes. And to explore the effects of these different factors, such as age or gender, on evacuation delay time. So the methodology that I used after I have gone through the literature review was something that I call CyberT framework, which is the main aspect that you should focus on if you really wanted to sort of look into what actually matters when looking at human behavior in wildfires. So this is involving context, information, behavior, emotion, risk, and time. And each of these aspects have associated questions that have actually led to development of the full questionnaire that was administered to public. And I have also looked at the qualitative and quantitative data collection. So I looked at the media content, survivors' accounts. I also interviewed fire safety managers, and I also, as I said, collected data using public questionnaires. And there were two types of questionnaires. There was a hypothetical questionnaire asking what people would do in a wildfire event, and also those that were actual experience questionnaires, wanting to understand how people behave in a certain situation when they experience a wildfire. So some of the qualitative findings from my research that have come from the media accounts was observing people driving through smoke, people being reported running for their life, relying on information that was often reported as lacking, and feeling a lot of emotions such as confusion, stress, terror, but at the same time also calmness and positivity. However, this type of research method, qualitative analysis of the media content, has certain limitations. For example, there's lack of cultural and policy context, so if you were reading an article on the newspaper, you wouldn't really know, and you wouldn't really be told what policies exist there in order to guide people through their evacuation. And these events and these media reports were also skewed mostly towards large events. Small events wouldn't be reported as much unless they were unusual to that place, and these events wouldn't have taken place before. So another stream of qualitative findings came from the interviews with fire safety managers. So what was really useful from these interviews was understanding community resistance to the fire hazard mitigation and response system, and understanding that the tourist population and the holidaymakers are especially vulnerable in these situations because of the difference in language in some situations that they speak, and difficulties in following instructions that they might be given by the fire safety managers, and the differences between the two study areas, which of course I forgot to mention. I looked at the south of France and I looked at the Australia population. So the differences between these two areas were in terms of preparedness, response, and inappropriate behaviors. So there were some inappropriate behaviors in south of France, for example, looking at fire, taking pictures of the fire, or blocking the roads, that were not so much observed in Australian populations. And there were similarities between the two study areas. surprisingly for me, it seemed that evacuation is relatively a new practice in both south of France and Australia. And I should mention that when I looked at Australia, I mostly looked at Victoria state, which has different evacuation policies to the rest of Australia, in fact, or at least so had until the really, really recent events. And people often are told to drive really fiercely or really carelessly through the roads that are obstructed by smoke, and that often results in things like collisions that are, additional threats to what wildfire is already sort of imposing. However, this method itself was also limited because I noticed that the experiences of first responders are contained within their practice. That means it's difficult to generalize. So we could know a lot about the individual region, but it would be very difficult to understand how that cuts across and what are the things that would be useful when understanding human behavior across the scale in different regions. So I looked at the quantitative results from the public survey data. And I looked at the outcomes for what motivates planning, pre-event risk, immediate responses, intentions, evacuation or staying in place, decision choice, destination choice, future decision, and evacuation delay time. So there were several findings across the board for this. So pre-event risk and planning affected by contextual internal and external characteristics. And this is what I was referring to as being, of a different, in a different sort of category of age, or having dependence, such as children, or having an involvement in their community. So people are very involved into, fire mitigation in their community. They would probably be more aware of certain risks. So what was interesting is that intentions for decision making in wildfire were significantly associated with a range